Those arguing for adoption of the rand say a weaker currency will make local businesses more competitive and thus boost exports. South Africa is Zimbabwe's biggest economic partner, accounting for 60% of trade, and so adopting its currency makes logical sense. But the biggest opposing argument is the rand's volatility. Also, as anti-rand supporters argue, it's already an accepted legal tender here. All that needs to be done is to encourage its wider use. Local businesses, in particular retailers, are seen as key in driving uptake of the South African unit. But that hasn't happened. I asked one expert why.
Imagine a Coca-Cola is $1, right, in Zimbabwe. In rand, it's 6 rand, right? So when you are going to price a Coca-Cola, you are pricing for $1 in Zimbabwe. What rand price are you going to put? Right? Because you can't then say it's 20 rand. I would rather go and buy my own stuff in South Africa and bring it than buy locally. So it creates a great, so the retailers are faced with a pricing difference problem, because then everything has to adjust.
There's also a feeling that even if the South African rand were to be adopted, it may not be a silver bullet.
We don't have a currency problem in Zimbabwe. Our problem is a production problem. So regardless of which currency you're going to use, as long as you don't address production issues, you end up at the same place. Let's rather focus on the production side of the economy and not worry too much about the currency, because currency sorts itself. It reacts to productive capacity.
Now, it may not be the news that ordinary Zimbabweans want to hear, but getting production up again may take some time. And that means they may have to wait a little longer to see the end of this crisis. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Well, Farai Mwakutuya joins us in Harare now with more on this. Farai, welcome to the show. Now, with regards to these currency issues, the IMF actually came out quite strong this week against these bond notes, saying they're not really helping with Zimbabwe's cash shortages. Has the government responded to the IMF's counsel?
Well, the government has said that, they appreciate that the bond notes alone are not a solution entirely to the problems that Zimbabwe is facing. The bond notes were a means to an end. They were introduced as a short-term measure to try and incentivize production and exports so that more foreign currency can be generated. So the government acknowledges that bond notes are not the panacea to the challenges here. But I think the fact that the government continues to engage, as it has been for the past few years, with the IMF is an indication that it is willing to take the counsel of the IMF, to take the advice and to be supervised by the IMF in a bid to get itself out of the current challenges, but also to be readmitted into the global financial markets.
Now, Farai, as you mentioned just now, the central bank has actually stopped injecting those bond notes into the economy. In fact, the central bank governor, Mangudya, says they'll stop injecting the new notes for now until what he calls fiscal discipline is reached. Now, what exactly is this fiscal discipline? What do you make of what he said?
Well, I think this is an indication of the frustration that the central bank governor is feeling. He has been calling on business as well as the ordinary general public to be more prudent, to be more frugal in how they use the country's precious foreign currency resources. He's been calling for more productive use of money, so less use on consumptive issues. But despite his calls, that hasn't been happening. We still see a lot of money being used for consumption and production. We still see a lot of money not being put through the formal banking channels, and we still see, unfortunately, a lot of money being siphoned out of the country. And I think the central bank governor is now coming out to lay out these conditions, to give an ultimatum, perhaps saying that, no more Mr. Nice Guy. I've tried to use moral suasion. That hasn't worked. And so now he's setting out these conditions and laying out these ultimatums in a bid to try and see, to try and get, the sort of response that he's looking for, which is that discipline you're talking about, the formalization of money and less use of foreign currency for non-productive sources. Uche.
Well, Farai, a little bit more on these structural reforms that the IMF called for. We know the Treasury has come out and said the country's growth rate will actually be revised up from about 1.7% to almost 4%, of course, on a strong performance in the agricultural sector. Now, does this indicate that we're seeing some of those structural reforms? And certainly, what has been taking place in terms of structural reforms?
Well, the finance ministry says that it is restructuring the civil service because that's the biggest headache that Zimbabwe faces. Its wage bill is just exorbitant, 95%. So it's looking to address its expenses on that end by restructuring the civil service, redirecting, manpower from areas that are overstaffed to areas that are understaffed. And in that regard, trying to manage the wage bill and where possible, reduce it. It's also looking to address issues of expenditure. The finance minister, when I spoke to him a few weeks ago, said that he would look to reduce, travel expenses, to look at things such as the government's vehicle fleet. Those are areas that have come in for criticism and areas that he's looking to address. He's also saying that, look, we need not just to address the expensive side, but also the productive side. So we need to be able to generate more. And so government is expediting legislation that allows it to, attract more investment. For instance, and I'll make special reference to the Special Economic Zones bill that, waives the indigenization requirement for companies that invest in these special economic zones. And by doing that, government is hoping to attract more capital into the country, to increase production, to increase exports, and grow the national cake, basically.
Well, we'll certainly be watching. Many thanks for that, Farai. Farai Mwakutuya, of course, joining us there in Harare.